Instrumentalism is one of a multitude of modern schools of thought created by scientists and philosophers throughout the 20th century. Its premises and practices were most clearly and persuasively stated by two philosophers, John Dewey and Karl Popper. Independently, they defined the school quite similarly, but their judgments of it were irreconcilable. Dewey was a practitioner of instrumentalism. He insisted that modern scientific inquiry requires both induction and deduction, while denying its capacity to uncover realities independent of experience. Popper was a critic of the school. He insisted that induction is not scientifically valid, and that realities can be known without experience. These contrary judgments endowed the school with the legacy of confusion and ambiguity described below. This article reports the definition of instrumentalism accepted by these two philosophers. It explains the grounds of their irreconcilable judgments, which are still embedded in popular understanding of the school, and it describes the practice of followers of each philosopher, demonstrating that neither philosopher's judgments have achieved universal assent, leaving the school's meaning and legitimacy in modern scientific inquiry indeterminate. Instrumentalism defined. In 1925, John Dewey published an article entitled The Development of American Pragmatism, in which he defined instrumentalism to distinguish it from schools known as pragmatism and experimentalism. In 1956, Karl Popper published an article entitled Three Views Concerning Human Knowledge, in which he defined instrumentalism to distinguish it from essentialism, and a third view, his own, which he came to call critical rationalism. Dewey's article was republished in 1984 in John Dewey, The Later Works. Popper's article was republished in 1962 in Conjectures and Refutations. The following four premises defining instrumentalism are taken from these sources. Premises 1 and 2 were accepted by both philosophers and the general public. Premises 3 and 4 were and remain controversial. 1. Theories are conceptual maps, one tool of the trade of scientific inquiry. Dewey. Instrumentalism is an attempt to establish a precise logical theory of concepts, of judgments and inferences in their various forms, by considering primarily how thought functions in the experimental determinations of future consequences. Popper. Instrumentalism endorses the interpretation of scientific theories as practical instruments or tools for such purposes as the prediction of impending events. 2. Theories are tested by consequences, applying the instrumental criterion of judgment. Dewey. The verification of a theory is carried on by the observation of particular facts. Popper. We submit theories to severe tests by trying to deduce from them some of the regularities of the known world of common experience. 3. Theory development requires inductive reasoning, basing general statements on limited observations of facts of the case. Dewey. An empirical philosopher must first find particular cases from which he then generalizes. Popper. I am an opponent of the widely accepted dogma of inductivism, of the view that science starts from observation and proceeds, by induction, to generalizations, and ultimately to theories. 4. There are no realities behind or beyond what can be known by applying instrumental theories. Dewey. It is therefore in submitting conceptions to the control of experience that one finds examples of what is called truth. Popper. A representation of instrumentalism can be obtained by omitting the universe of the realities behind the various appearances. Instrumentalism is often identified with other schools which share some of these premises: positivism, pragmatism, operationalism, behaviorism, anti-realism, empiricism, consequentialism. Instrumentalism judged. Dewey and Popper disagreed on premises 3 and 4. The primary grounds of their disagreement were expounded in the 1930s. In 1935, Popper published Logic of Scientific Discovery, in which he used traditional logical forms to criticize modern schools of thought, including instrumentalism. In 1938, Dewey published Logic, the theory of inquiry, in which he reconstructed traditional logical forms to make them usable by modern schools of thought. Neither of these volumes used the name Instrumentalism, but both discussed and judged the premises above. Popper's critique. The opening paragraph of Popper's The Logic of Scientific Discovery observed that all modern empirical schools accept premises 1 and 2, which he later identified with instrumentalism. A scientist, whether theorist or experimenter, puts forward statements, or systems of statements, and tests them step by step. In the field of the empirical sciences, he constructs hypotheses, or systems of theories, and tests them against experience by observation and experiment. Several paragraphs later, he admitted the popularity of induction, premise 3, but denied its capacity to generate logically true theories. According to a widely accepted view, to be opposed in this book, the empirical sciences can be characterized by the fact that they use inductive methods, as they are called. It is usual to call an inference inductive if it passes from singular statements, such as the results of observations or experiments, to universal statements, such as hypotheses or theories. Now, it is far from obvious, from a logical point of view, that we are justified in inferring universal statements from singular ones, no matter how numerous, for any conclusion drawn in this way may always turn out to be false. No matter how many instances of white swans we may have observed, this does not justify the conclusion that all swans are white. Popper's reference to swans recalls a famous historic error, the inductively derived belief that all swans are white. He labeled the practice illogical. Now in my view there is no such thing as induction. Thus, inference to theories, from singular statements which are verified by experience, is logically inadmissible. Popper rejected inductive reasoning in favor of deductive reasoning because he maintained that the former could not achieve logical form. Deduction can move from a self-evident universal statement, such as, all men are mortal, to true singular statements that every individual human is mortal, because the universal statement already embraces all singulars. But there can be no principle by which a singular statement can justify a universal, because no singular statement can report observing all of any kind. For the principle of induction must be a logically necessary, universal statement in its turn. To justify it, we should have to employ inductive inferences, and to justify these we should have to assume an inductive principle of a higher order, and so on. Thus the attempt to base the principle of induction on experience breaks down, since it must lead to an infinite regress. Popper rejected induction, premise 3, but not premise 2, the criterion of instrumental efficiency. He argued that deduction could serve modern science, not by assuming general statements to be true, but by providing general statements testable by their consequences. Falsification works when experience contradicts a theory's predictions. It must be possible for an empirical scientific system to be refuted by experience. I can therefore gladly admit that falsificationists like myself much prefer an attempt to solve an interesting problem by a bold conjecture, even if it soon turns out to be false, to any recital of a sequence of irrelevant truisms. Popper rejected premise 4 because it denies the distinction between pure and applied science. He granted that science might apply empirical or instrumental theories, but asserted that epistemological or reality-based theories, revealing truths independently of experience, are equally valid. His evidence was that pure sciences such as mathematics and logic can make true statements without observing facts of the case. Logically true theories don't require establishing facts of the case, they can be conjectural myths, derived from inspiration or chance, which are psychologically or genetically a priori, i.e., prior to all observational experience. They can also precede observation or recognition of similarities and differences. The question of how it happens that a new idea occurs to a man, whether it be a musical theme, a dramatic conflict, or a scientific theory, may be of great interest to empirical psychology, but it is irrelevant to the logical analysis of scientific knowledge. The latter is concerned not with questions of fact, but only with question of justification or validity. Instrumentalism's premise for denying logically certain deductive truths threatens the idea of the objectivity of knowledge and of common standards of criticism or rationality, because instrumentalists claim that truth is always situational. They forfeit their capacity to explain sciences in which the instrumental criterion of judgment cannot be applied. In pure sciences, the criterion is logically established truth, not what works or is useful given temporary conditions. Summing up, we may say that instrumentalism is unable to account for the importance to pure science of testing severely even the most remote implications of its theories, since it is unable to account for the pure scientist's interest in truth and falsity. In contrast to the highly critical attitude requisite in the pure scientist, the attitude of instrumentalism is one of complacency at the successive applications. Dewey's reconstruction. Dewey's logic of 1938 was very different from Popper's logic of 1935. While Popper used traditional logical forms to criticize the modern practice of induction, Dewey reconstructed those forms. He addressed the problem of whether scientific inquiry can develop in its own ongoing course the logical standards and forms to which further inquiry shall submit. His affirmative answer is the substance of premise 4, which traditional logic led Popper to deny. Dewey's logic did not name instrumentalism or pragmatism, but argued that both schools treat theories as tools for producing consequences. Premises 1 and 2. Consequences are necessary tests of the validity of propositions, provided these consequences are operationally instituted and are such as to resolve the specific problem evoking the operations. When Dewey analyzed induction, premise 3, he accepted its standard meaning of processes for developing general propositions from particular cases. He explained why Aristotle's application of this method to eternal forms and kinds was no longer acceptable. Popper partially repudiated Aristotle's belief that superior intellects can intuit the essence of eternal forms by observing physically changing forms. Each observed swan is an imperfect sample of universal but unobservable swanness. But he provided no rational means to carry out induction's necessary function of establishing the facts of the case by relating singular observations of kinds to general statements about kinds. Dewey's instrumental analysis did provide such means by reconstructing both induction and deduction. One may think of a singular observation, i.e., this swan is white, as an isolated fact without general reference. But Dewey insisted that such an observation necessarily involves the general meaning of swan as a particular kind of bird. If one were not familiar with a kind of animal having numerous well-established characteristics, one could not name it either bird or swan. Kinds, including species, do not exist apart from experience. They are created by inquiries which, contrary to Popper, use induction to distinguish stable characteristics of experience from accidental or irrelevant characteristics. Dewey argued that modern science does not treat particular observations as knowledge of what is real. One does not assume, after a few observations, that whiteness is a defining characteristic of swans. Particular observations are selectively discriminated so as to determine a problem whose nature is such as to indicate possible modes of solution. Observations become facts of the case only after being causally related to a problem. Dewey supported this theoretical generalization with an example of medical knowledge. The case of malaria shows how modern induction avoids Popper's charge of requiring endless observations. After certain, singular, symptoms came to be recognized as constituting a disease, it was named malaria, literally, bad air, as a common-sense conjecture about its cause. Premise 1. Popper might have considered that conjecture to be testable by predicting that the disease would be absent in environments with good air, but testing a prediction about air quality could not have led to new insights. It was an insignificant fact of the case. When further observations, applying premise 3, identified the conjunction of parasites with the disease, experiments revealed the life history of particular parasites and their relation to a particular kind of mosquito, Anopheles. At each stage of inquiry, particular observations, inductions, led to general hypotheses, deductions, guiding further observations to establish logically warranted particular and general propositions. Multiple theories generated by induction were used throughout the process of inquiry. They evolved from quite conjectural to quite confirmed generalizations, but never from conjectural myths to truths independent of observable life processes. The result of this hypothetical deductive sequence was to establish malaria as a specific kind of disease with a determinate etiology. Dewey affirmed the logical force of this demonstration. It provides the logical principle justifying induction, the possibility of which Popper denied. When it is affirmed that inductive inference proceeds from what happens in some cases to what is true of all cases, the phrase, all cases, must, of course, be limited to all cases of specified kind. But if the kind is already determined in the some cases from which the inference is said to proceed, the alleged inference is a matter of pure tautology, since a kind is the kind which it is with this logical principle. Dewey validated induction, premise 3, as well as his rejection of realms such as pure science capable of establishing objective truths unknowable by applied science, premise 4. He argued that warranted generalizations never exist apart from experience. They arise only in the process of inquiry, making invalid any claim to truths logically prior to observation or recognition of similarities and differences, but the dependence of warranted theories on situational factors. Induction does not eliminate objective standards of judgment, as Popper feared. Both ends and means have consequences that can be judged more or less instrumentally efficient. Premise 2. There is no more fatal flaw in psychology than that which takes the original vague forefeling of some consequence, Popper's conjecture, to be realized as the equivalent of a thought of an end, a true purpose and directive plan. Popper's tested theory. The thought of an end is strictly correlative to perception of means and methods. Only when and as the latter becomes clear, by induction, during the serial process of execution does the project in guiding aim and plan theory become evident and articulated. In the full sense of the word, a person becomes aware of what he wants to do, end in view, and what he is about only when the work is actually complete. In summary, Dewey's reconstruction of logic directly refuted Popper's argument for rejecting induction and for maintaining the distinction between pure and applied science. His instrumentalism requires hypothetical deductive operations to establish warranted assertions to solve problems, employing all four premises.